Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. Dear Family will explore many angles of mental illness, including isolation, drug addiction, and even suicide. Sounds like fun, huh? Well, you'd be surprised, actually, because once we get so invested with Rachel's guests, we can actually relate to many of the issues that naturally arise during her conversations, and what often follows is a knowing laughter. So yes, expect tears of heartfelt empathy, but don't be surprised if you chuckle now and then. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Devorah Heitner is not just another mom concerned about raising a digital native. She uses her Ph.D. in technology to research, teach, write, and lecture about how families' everyday lives are affected by digital media, smartphones, and video games. She's the author of Screenwise, Helping Kids Thrive and Survive in Their Digital World, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time magazine. Devorah did a great TEDx talk about cultivating a culture of empathy and social-emotional literacy around kids and technology. She recently wrote a fantastic article for the Washington Post about how a smartphone would have saved her mother who had learning disabilities. Anytime parents find out her line of work, she gets cornered because every parent is anxious about their kids multitasking, their social skills, them taking and receiving naughty pictures, cyberbullying, and, well, the list can go on and on. But Devorah paints a brighter picture. She's a media historian here today to let us know our concerns over digital media are a normal cycle of historical anxiety. And although we need to be cautious about technology, we also need to celebrate the freedom that the technology allows us and our families. Hi, Devorah. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Well, you came to mind as a perfect guest because you help families all the time achieve mental health. And I just want to let our viewers know that you live in Chicago, but we first met when you came to speak at my daughter's school for a parent education evening in Los Angeles. And it was right around the same time that I gave my middle schooler her first smartphone. And like me, there were tons of parents in this assembly because it was packed. And we were all trying to just navigate this uncharted territory and just kind of avoid the many pitfalls of device addiction. But what I really appreciated about you and what just struck a chord with me was your lack of doom and gloom. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But I remember you asked the crowd of adults if they wished that they could have grown up with a device like our kids have. And almost all the hands stayed down. And just here's a little side note. I asked my husband, who is a tech lover, and he said he would have raised his hand because he's a futurist and he loves science and technology. Anyways, your talk really inspired me. And I ended up writing an essay on Medium called, Is There an App to Stop Me from Screaming at My Kids About Their Device Use? And I'll put that in the show notes. But like most parents sitting in that assembly, we raised our hands because we were nostalgic for the times when we were forced to get outside and be social with friends, face to face and not screen to screen. And yet, I think oh my God, if they suddenly took them away from us, we wouldn't know how to function. So in your words, because you have such a great background of talking to kids and going in and actually speaking with kids, why should we not fear technology?
Well, we shouldn't fear technology because it's in our control, where it's not 1984 and
right.
HAL hasn't taken over. And so the bots are still doing what we tell them to do. So if you're fearing technology, just, hit the off button or put it away, put it in a drawer. I mean, all the time we should be thinking about how can I be running my tech and not let it run me, right? Whether it's your inbox, if you're flying by the seat of your pants by your inbox, and we've all had those days, or if social media is leading your emotions around, then you want to rethink that relationship. You want to be in charge of your inbox and your life and your day, and your tech shouldn't be kind of running you. And I think it's really important that we teach kids that and that kids see us modeling that. And that's really hard because a lot of us are letting our phones run us.
That's really true. I mean, I admit to my addiction to my phone. And I try to model not using it. But that leads me to the question about you really talking about how we should be mentors rather than policing our children's devices. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so parents often ask me, what's the app I can use to monitor my kid so I can read all her texts, or I can see every site he visits, or I understand the impulse to try to track your kid all over, whether it's even using the geo tracker on their iPhone to know where they physically are. And I totally get that temptation. But we should really be thinking about how we can mentor our kids so that they make positive, thoughtful decisions, because you're not going to want to be reading their text when they're 23, even when they're 19, hopefully even when they're 17, right? Like, so there's a point where maybe you think you want to read your 11-year-old's text, but where is that going? And wouldn't it be better to be looking at them together if you are going to do it? Certainly, I would say don't do it covertly, right? If you are going to read your kids' texts or track the sites that they visit, I would make sure that they know you're doing that. And then I would make sure you're having conversations with them about what they're doing and their experiences so that you can get their perspective on what they think is happening. You know, why do they love that YouTuber? What's happening on Snapchat that's interesting? Your kid's not going to be dying to tell you everything that's going on Snapchat.
Right.
But
That's what I was thinking.
That your kid is doing drugs and selling them on Snapchat either. Like, just because your 13-year-old doesn't want to reveal her inner world, that's developmentally typical, that your kids are going to be more private and more focused on their peer group, and their disclosure with you is going to be somewhat limited depending on their personality. But you can definitely cultivate a conversation that's more open about tech, and you can tie that to some degree to being allowed to use tech. Right. But if you're tracking, if you're spying, if your kids don't feel trusted, you know, they're going to be really more secretive often, and it can drive the relationship in a negative direction.
Right. Well, that's an interesting thought because, for example, we use Custodio. Our kids know we use Custodio. Do you think that kids knowing that there are these apps on their phones, does that make them more secretive potentially? Or
it's better that they know. Some kids will have said to me that they feel safer with their parents tracking them. And for younger kids, it can also be a boundary they can share with their peers. I mean, most ninth graders won't say, oh, my dad looks at my phone, so don't use those kind of bad language, words. But a sixth grader might use that as a boundary with peers very effectively and say, my dad or my mom look at my phone, I'm going to get in trouble if you text me at 2 a.m. or if you use that kind of language. And that's a great boundary that you hope will transition to your 10th grader gets a gross pic from a guy and is offended and can block him herself without needing to come to you. You know what I mean? And like, obviously, if she's being harassed or something's kind of an ongoing or she's frightened, then she should come to you. But you kind of want your kids to start not using you as the first line of defense, especially if it's someone else wanting them to rule break or cross their own boundaries. Like if someone is trying to engage them into mean conversation about another kid or a teacher, your 6th grader, your 5th grader might need to use you as a backstop and say, well, let's not go there because I could get in trouble. But you kind of hope your 10th grader, your 11th grader would be like, don't be an asshole.
Right. I remember you saying that it's so much better for you to model the behavior of how you text politely as opposed to spending your time sneaking behind their backs and looking at their texts.
Absolutely.
And that kind of brings me to the next question, because I know you have your Ph.D. in media technology and society, but you believe that actually kids are the experts. So can you tell us more about that?
We really want to understand the ways kids are using tech. Like most of us are not going to group text the way a 7th grader is going to group text. And so I might group text to plan an event, but I always regret it when I do try to group text because it's always wrong. And there's always someone in a different time zone who's asleep and is annoyed and then it's pinging on them and they're pissed. So I feel like group text is really not something I want to use, but I need to understand it if I'm talking to 11 to 15-year-olds because they do want to group text. And that is a way that they're communicating. And they find it annoying too, but they're kind of willing to deal with it. So that's a good example of we all have the same technology that we're dealing with. We're all using maybe a texting program. They might be doing it on WhatsApp or another, but it's basically the same thing as any kind of texting. It's not that they've invented this whole new technology. It's not like maybe Fortnite or Snapchat where maybe as an adult, I'm like, well, I don't play Fortnite, so I don't understand this. Texting is the exact same tech, but we're using it differently. And that's where we really want to talk to kids and find out, okay, so what is the rule in your friend group about a group text? And what does it mean if somebody gets left off the text? And why do you feel so passionately about not getting left off? With tech where I'm less familiar, like say I'm a parent whose kid is into Fortnite and I have no clue about Fortnite, then I want my kid to give me at least a guided tour, a little expose. I want to understand it. If my kid is younger, I might want to check that out before they even play it because maybe I don't want my 1st grader playing a last person standing shooter game. But if it's my 8th grader and I let go of that fight long ago, I'm saying, yes, you can play it. I still want to understand, hey, how are you spending this time? What are the kinds of interactions you can have in this space? Because especially with a public gaming server, you're talking about, it's the world. I mean, you're playing with people you don't know. There's some complexity there. So you as a parent want to understand, not from your own perspective, but from their perspective, what they think is going on.
That's great advice. Like almost in a way, kind of play stupid, right? And have them show you.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if you have a teenager, they think dumb anyway. So it's really easy to play dumb because they already think that we know nothing.
Right. So right. They're going to totally buy that. Well, and there are so many studies that show that depression and aggression increase when kids are addicted to video games that, just kind of suck their time when they're just, for example, Fortnite, which I'm sure you probably know this, but maybe others don't. Fortnite means 2 weeks. And just by a little side note, my 16-year-old says Fortnite is not as popular as it once was and that Minecraft is back in. But anyways, by the way, is that true? Do you know?
I mean, I think that Fortnite was incredibly popular for the last, 6 months or a year. And I was getting calls from schools to come and do evenings on Fortnite.
Right.
And now there are a couple of games that are coming in. But yeah, games fade in and out. Minecraft, I think, stands the test of time in a deep way because there's so much complexity to it.
Right. There's a lot of positivity to Minecraft.
Right. Like I could play it with other adults and we could add, completely different layers than, elementary schoolers or high schoolers who are playing it. And it's also, there's different modes of play. So I think that's more of a rich world. Or you think of something like The Sims, which has been around for more than 10 years, and there's still people coming into that. So when you have something that's really almost about world building, like Minecraft or Sims, I think that's going to be different than, a Fortnite, which we'll see. But I mean, there's certainly people who are still very captured by it and interested in it, but maybe there's not quite as much going on. And even if you can make a new skin, there's some variation that they can bring in to make it exciting or a new version. There might not be as much depth there.
I have to say, so I have daughters and I'm not trying to generalize. They loved Minecraft. They did not really play Fortnite, but I know Fortnite is a third-person shooter game and it's violent. And often a lot of these video games are violent. I know it kind of desensitizes kids. And I think that's what makes parents nervous, in addition to the fact that there's live chats and who knows what could potentially happen in those live chats. What do you say to an anxious parent who is fighting with their child over the amount of time they're spending playing video games?
I would really look at the role of conflict in the family and say, is this really a conflict in the family? Is this affecting my child's behavior? If it's just that I don't think it's the best way for them to spend their time, I would really think hard about the way you spent time at their age. Like I spent a lot of time on the phone with my friends, playing songs for my friends on the radio when I was 13 and 14. And I'm not sure that's was the highest and best use of my time. Was I doing some activism with Amnesty International or protesting the Gulf War? Yes. Did I probably spend more time on the phone with my friends playing songs for them on the radio and mooning over movie stars? Absolutely. You have to look at kids at that age and say, expecting them to spend all of their time to a higher and better purpose may not be realistic. If it's eating into sleep, if it's affecting their mental health, if it's turning them into a monster that can't sit at the table or, interact with a family pet or their siblings at all, right? Or if they're not doing their homework, if they're not taking showers, then I'm very concerned, right? So there's a huge range of behaviors around games. Preferring to play a video game over taking out the trash is not an addiction.
Right.
The kid whose mental health is of concern, the kid who's having extreme conflicts with parents, but really where a parent is worried that your kid might hit you or that the neighbors might call social services because of the yelling in your apartment, you want to reach out yourself and get some support in that case. And it may not be the game. The game may be a proxy for some other conflict, or it may be that the game doesn't work for your kid right now because it's too sticky, right? I'm not going to use the word addictive, even though we know that these games are designed to keep you coming back. And especially games like Fortnite were designed with some of the same principles as actually like Las Vegas kind of gambling, right? To make you feel like you almost won, so you want to play another round. There is similar psychology in a game like Fortnite. So yes, it is sticky, but there are plenty of kids who play who are able to pull away and do other things. And so I would really look at what's the effect on my kid. And violence, luckily, the research shows is not an effect of video games. And you know what? We'd all be dead if it was.
All right. See, there you go.
You're walking around Los Angeles with thousands of people on the streets every day who are gamers.
Right.
And they're not all killers, right? I mean, there's more better research than that, but just know that a lot of people play video games, and some people even think it's a way for especially adolescent males to take out some aggression that's otherwise forbidden in society, right? We don't let kids have fistfights. We don't let kids drag race. Think about the ways teenage people, especially young men, got out their aggression in past decades and how those things are off the table now.
Okay. And this is what I love about you, Devorah. You put positive spins on things, and it's nice to hear, but you're also saying that, if there's a problem, reach out for resources. And what resources would you recommend?
Well, I'm a huge fan of therapy. I've been in therapy on and off for years. I would totally take my kid to therapy if screens were, again, presenting a huge source of conflict in the family.
So do you mean like a child psychologist?
Yeah. Or, we have seen a social worker in my house of other kinds of behavior things not around screens. That hasn't for us been like a huge issue. Certainly, there are definitely days where we've had conflicts on screens. It's not like writing a book on kids and screens gives me a free pass. And my kid never wants to do things with tech that I don't want him to do in that moment.
Right. It's universal.
But there are other behaviors that have come up where I needed help as a parent. And we actually were able to find, and it's hard to find this, but I'm in Chicago. And if you're in a large community like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, you may be able to find this. In a smaller community, it might be hard to find. But we had a social worker who was willing to come to the house. And in the early childhood years, that's ideal, right? Like he came to the house when my son was 3 or 4. I can't remember exactly when this was, but it was great because we needed some help with some behavior issues. And we didn't know the ways we were contributing as parents, but we suspected we could do better, right? I have a PhD in media technology and society, not in early childhood. And lots of people who have PhDs in early childhood still might need support in parenting.
That's right. Would you also add, because you go into so many schools, that parents could try also turning to a mental health advisor at the school?
It really varies depending on where you are, but absolutely one of the things that school can do is help you know what things are developmentally typical. Because generally, like say you have a second grader, even if you have 5, you've only known 5 second graders. Like even if you have a bigger family than I do, I have 1 kid. Your school has known thousands of second graders. They can tell you how kind of out of step developmentally something is. Like if your second grader is having meltdowns, they can tell you like, you know what, second graders don't typically have this level of meltdown. Maybe this kid isn't neurotypical, maybe OT support, or maybe this kid could use speech therapy because the reason they're having meltdowns is they can't express themselves and other kids are able to do much more complex narratives at this age. So these are the kinds of things where a school is much more likely to have a sense of scale, or a school might say, you know what, your kid seems really anxious to you, but we've seen a fair amount of this. We're not that concerned. Like, how about a yoga class? How about mindfulness? Like, not everything needs therapy. Some kids really love martial arts. Some kids really do well with theater classes. So I think school can be great. That said, school sometimes can make you feel really bad as a parent. I've had both experiences. I've been totally shamed at school for things my kid is doing where I feel like they're looking at me. I had in kindergarten, I was told because I travel for work that my son was a wreck. And at that time, I was either a primary or sole breadwinner. I can't remember if I was the only income at the moment. My husband and I have both done a lot of different things. I think I was primary income. And so I thought in my head to that teacher, oh, do you think my son would be better adjusted if we were living in our car? Like if I couldn't pay the mortgage, do you think that would be like an improvement in his mental health? Or do you think mommy should keep working and bringing in the mortgage?
Did you say that?
So, no, but I thought it in my head and I have loved to say it. But I think that's the kind of thing where she thought, yeah, you know what? My kid probably was a wreck when I was out of town. But was that the best alternative for us? And was it helpful for her to let me know that she thought all his behavior issues were my fault? I'm not sure it was helpful.
And that just goes to show, because I am a former teacher. And I remember before I had kids looking at some of these parents and thinking like, come on, get it together. How can you not have time to read to your kid every night? But my point being is that teachers, administrators, therapists, we're human, right? So if something doesn't work or feels wrong, just keep exploring,
Absolutely. Whether you're in an independent or a public school, they should at least minimally know resources in the community.
That's right.
And if you're having issues at home, especially if your school is giving your kid a lot of tech and you have a kid for whom tech is a sticking point, like I've met a lot of parents, often kids with ADHD or on the spectrum, or just kids for whom tech is very sticky and very attractive, where the school is giving the kids tech, I would definitely try to collaborate in that case and say, you know what, I have a kid who is going to flip through every app on this iPad every 5 minutes unless you lock down the iPad at school. And I'm letting you know that right now, like we need to work together to support, because I think a lot of the ed tech innovations are great for, 80 or 90% of kids. And then some kids are going to need more support around them. And it's so important there that schools and parents work together.
I love that. Yes. Good. Okay. And then, you talked about modeling behavior, and it would be hard to model behavior if you haven't experienced it. So, for example, I'm thinking about your teenager is home on a Saturday night watching a party unfold that she wasn't invited to in real time. Yes, as teens, we may have remembered feeling like we weren't included, but it wasn't so in our face. How do you counsel parents on that, or teenagers for that matter, or tweens? What do you say?
Well, first, it is devastating, right? And I think that as someone who was so out in middle school and high school that I probably didn't even really know all the things I wasn't invited to. And that was probably a blessing, right? I had my little robust friend group. And really, I was able to kind of operate with the idea that that was the center of the world, because it was the center of my world. And it's really best for kids to believe that in many ways. And for all of us to be more focused on our own, families and friends, and not like who we're not friends with or the things we're left out of. So I think it is really tough. I would definitely encourage from the beginning, when your kid is thinking about who to follow, thinking about following only people who are inclusive and make you feel good, ideally. As you cast a wider net, as you get older, that gets trickier, because kids do want to kind of follow people they think of as almost influencers, if you will. And if you talk to kids in high school, they will use that kind of language of influencers and being relevant. Kids will say, I can send you for your show notes. There's a really great This American Life on this, where these 9th grade girls in New York City are talking about being relevant. And it's very painful. You want to be empathetic to that. That's a good time to kind of play the heavy and try to get them to turn it off. I mean, I would try to do it with sweetness and light if you can, like, let's go out for ice cream. But if that doesn't work, you might want to be more assertive, because it's really important for kids to do something else. And one thing I like to do is brainstorm with kids as young as 6th grade. What can you do in that scenario when you are feeling left out? And the most important thing is put down your phone. But I was with a group of 6th graders in one city, and they came up with, watch your favorite show on Netflix, go out with other friends. Some of them were honest enough to say, invite other friends over and take a picture, which I thought was really funny, and something a lot of adults might think about doing, but might not admit that they would think about. But what was so great is the kids said that, and then all the other kids were laughing, and they all knew that they would probably do that.
Right. And also to let them know they're not alone, right? This happens to even whoever the influencer is feels left out at certain times.
And sometimes parents might be surprised because they think their kid is at the center. And sometimes kids who are more at the center socially feel every little exclusion more intensely. Your kid who really is focused on one or two besties and is not in the social fray that much may actually weather some of these storms more easily and not focus on the things that he or she is not included. And this does happen to boys too. And I think we imagine girls suffering this kind of exclusion more, but girls are vulnerable to this, but so are boys. And we sometimes imagine that, girls are, feeling this pain of exclusion more, but boys also can see images of anything that they're left out of and similarly feel bad. And also body image issues are coming up more and more for boys as well as girls in this digital age, because we're becoming so visual.
No, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think parents might forget that boys can feel very sensitive over those issues. So speaking of teens, the former Attorney General, John Ashcroft, has estimated that 9 in 10 teens have been exposed to pornography. And unfortunately, many of these teens are susceptible to developing addictions or compulsions to these images. And I feel sorry for our kids if they're seeing things that they don't want to, or they're being sexualized too early. I've had conversations with my teenagers about sending or receiving nudes. And what I always say is, if a college counselor or a boss can't see this image, don't send it. I'm curious. Can you just talk a little bit about this very kind of uncomfortable topic?
Sure. I mean, pornography is a real concern, much more explicit and often violent than the Playboy magazine we all might have found kind of lying around somewhere in our childhoods. So it's not just sort of naked ladies anymore. And I think that is really different. So, I mean, there was obviously a level of exploitation and objectification built into porn always. But now we're also looking at things that might not be consensual, that might be violent. I think there's a difference between video and photography as well. It is concerning because it is really hard to get kids to talk about what they've seen, and they know that they weren't supposed to have seen it. And so you might not know that your kid is seeing this stuff. And it's just very, very easy to find, and it's free. And a lot of the barriers that we might think would be there from kids finding porn aren't there. I mean, YouTube is filled with porn. And so that's very concerning. And that's the piece that's enough to get me to feel like, oh, should we lock this all down? Because you can look at porn in the library, right? I could filter my kid's phone and then he could go to the library and see porn on the unfiltered internet at the library, or on a friend's phone, more likely, right? We have to talk to them proactively, and at an age maybe when they still think sex is gross, talk to your 9 and 10-year-old like, hey, if somebody wants to show you naked people on the internet, this is why you don't want to look at that. And then keep returning to it. And we need to talk to girls as well as boys, because all kids are going to porn partly for how-to and sex ed. So we need to give them positive consent-based sex ed that really supports their actual needs. And we need to do it at a younger age than we think, but we also need to return to it. I mean, kids are actually dating and having sex later, but they're exposed to explicit images earlier. So there's for a lot of kids, a 5 to 10 year period where they could be watching porn, but they're not actually having sex, right? So kids in our generation and previous generations actually had sex and relationships younger than these kids.
I wonder if it's partly like they're grossed out by some of what they see.
Kids, it is horrifying. I mean, you see, I don't know if you watch The Fosters.
I don't know, but I remember my daughters did.
Fosters, a really lovely character comes out as gay, and in middle school, I think he's an 8th grader in that season. And then his boyfriend is interested in having sex, and they've just been kissing, I think, or I don't know, they hadn't gone all the way. And he looks at porn for some information and advice, and he's completely icked out and delays getting into more sexual relationship with his boyfriend. And, had they had access to better information, right? The boy who's the show is about has lesbian foster parents who are supportive, right? But he still doesn't get good sex ed at school. And there's a plot line where then they actually offer LGBTQ friendly sex ed, but it's outside of school because they can't get around the sort of prohibition to do it in school. And this is, again, in a really progressive school, but they just can't. That's what's so amazing. I would never want a kid of any gender identity or sexual orientation to feel that they have nowhere to turn for sex positive, consent-based education. And that's what I experienced in the Unitarian Universalist movement in the 90s. And I wasn't even part of that church. I'm Jewish, but I had access to the UU sex ed curriculum in camp because I went to UU camp. And I know that they still do a really good job with that. And that's one of the best curriculums I've seen. But schools are not doing a great job. Most schools are not. I mean, there's definitely some independent schools that are. Most public schools are very limited in what they do. I know in my community, there is some consent education. There's some puberty education. It's not the worst. It's certainly better than a lot of places, which is, abstinent only, where they're telling kids just don't do it. No actual information about what if that's not your plan.
Right.
Talking about a country and a time where people aren't getting married until their 30s. I think it's pretty safe to say that it's not realistic to expect that most people are going to wait until marriage.
Right.
So I think it's really important that we give kids access to information, as well as making sure that our kids have access to physicians if they need physicians. If your kid needs to talk to someone about birth control that's not you, for example, that they know they have privacy with their doctor. And these are things to talk to them about and make sure that they're not going to porn or going to the internet for sex education. There are a few really good sites on the internet, like Scarleteen, that have really accurate and good information. But in general, I think a book is ideal. The internet is filled with rabbit holes. So even if you start on an appropriate site, it'd be very easy to go into an inappropriate or an explicit site that does not have your kids' well-being in mind.
Do you have any books in mind?
I love Deborah Rothman, Talk to Me First, and I might have a few other suggestions that I can give you.
Okay, great. And I will put those in the show notes. Thank you so much.
There definitely are really great books, and there are great books for kids of every age. And again, also every gender identity. And there are definitely books, that are sort of more specifically for queer kids, books that are more specifically for boys or girls. But there is a lot out there. And even for your younger kids, if they're into graphic novels, there's a lot of comics books, even basic, like how are babies made kind of information. So if your, 3rd grader doesn't know where babies come from and you aren't ready to have the conversation yet, get them a graphic novel about it. And that's what's so great is we do live in this time of proliferation. We live in this time where you can digitally review a book and have a look at it before you buy it. Your local bookstore and your library probably have a lot of great books. So there's no shortage of good resources. The problem is there's such a proliferation, it can be hard to know where to start.
That makes sense. That definitely does. I know I can get overwhelmed. But back to the texting nudes, because I know that sometimes like teenager might do it out of just lust or just a moment of weakness. And those nudes can turn against the teenager. It makes me so nervous to think of any kind of images.
Yeah. And it's terrifying.
What are you going to say to your son when he gets of the age where, you know, that might be a possibility for him to send or receive?
Well, certainly I will talk to him about not asking, cajoling, begging, pushing, trying to badger girls or other boys, anyone, into sending him pictures. And I think it's really important that kids know that not to coerce other people, whether it's physically coercing them into a sexual act or coercing them into sending pictures or using pictures in a threatening way, like as blackmail. So consent is really important. But then ideally, what we can say to kids is we don't live in a world where this is a safe way to express your sexuality. We don't live in a world where this is a good idea. It's not that there's anything wrong with your body. And it's not wrong to want someone else to think your body is cute or attractive or hot, right? Like if you're into someone and they might be into you, like I think it's great if you want to know if they like you, but has to be another way to find that out. And I think a lot of parents would be horrified by that because it sounds like I'm saying like high school kids should just go have sex. But if they're ready and if they're in respectful relationships, it does seem better for them to have some kind of sexual relationship privately than to take pictures. That's the world we live in. It's not safe, right? You may feel differently. You may want your kid to delay sex until beyond high school, or you may feel beyond college. Who knows? Some parents want their kids to only have sex when they're married or only have sex in their 30s, whatever. But it's really important that you communicate what those values are about and also make sure that they know how to stay safe no matter whether they've chosen in accordance with your values or their own, and that they know to respect the desires and feelings and boundaries of other people. The problem with sharing nudes or even underwear pictures or anything suggestive is that it can easily get out of your control and become embarrassing. And I think about having crushes on boys in college and like leaving poems in their mailboxes and how embarrassing that could be. Or in grad school, someone broke up with me and actually like left a note, like just openly in my grad school mailbox, which was just like a cubby, which anyone could have seen. And, like that kind of thing is embarrassing, but it's still not as
it can't go viral.
Right. It's not as public as even things like promposals, which is very different than a nude picture, still puts a lot of pressure on young people and their relationships. I think the idea of like a promposal on YouTube or anything so public is very tricky because kids are moving through their phases of their identity and phases of attraction really rapidly at that age. And it's just not a great idea to have things kind of frozen in time and super public. It's a lot of pressure. So ideally, keeping those relationships offline and then letting kids know even that communication within a love relationship or dating relationship is something that needs to be negotiated. So if my sweetie is texting me all day, every day, that's something we can talk about. Maybe we can communicate about what is the expectation? How frequently are we going to communicate?
Okay, great. It's no wonder that teenagers feel so much anxiety when they have these pressures to have to get likes on promposals. That's like a whole other concept to me. And then the pressures that they are under to get into college. And I think social media just adds to the anxiety. And I know that teen sex is down, but anxiety and suicide is up among our youth.
Yes.
But to change gears a bit and again, put that positive spin because it's not all doom and gloom. You wrote such a fabulous essay for the Washington Post, which I will definitely link in the show notes, about your mom had learning disabilities. She had a smartphone. Why don't you tell us about this great article?
It would have saved her a lot of stress, and I think her life would have been better. And after I published the article, which really talks about she had a language-based learning disability, maybe something in the neighborhood of dyslexia. She never had a formal diagnosis. And also maybe some attention stuff and a lot of wayfinding challenges. So I think if the Google lady, that is who I call the voice from the map, if the Google lady had been there to just help my mom get around town and give her directions, if she had not had to worry so much about spelling because of spell check, these are essentially obsolete skills. Like wayfinding and spelling just are not the kind of important skills that they were, because we all have these devices that solve that problem. So if you happen to be awesome at direction or a really great speller, that's great for you. But if you suck at those things like my mother did, you can be fine. And she could never take a job that involved writing things for other people, really, because she was always so nervous about spelling, and it really impacted her. She also had terrible handwriting, right? Which again, talk about another obsolete skill. I mean, beyond 4th or 5th grade, most kids aren't going to handwrite much at school. So even kids are keyboarding younger and younger and younger. And so that skill just becomes less and less crucial. And when that happens, it opens up these possibilities for someone who has terrible handwriting. So I think for my mother, having a phone would have made it possible, and having spell check on a computer would have made it possible for her to imagine a very different life, because she was very bright, but she just couldn't really find her way to a career. She always struggled in school. She had very bad grades, which affected her self-esteem. And I think if she had had accommodations, certainly, and especially if she had had the kind of tech support that we have now. And again, not to minimize, I mean, if anyone listening has a language-based learning, like dyslexia or another disability along those lines, dyscalculia, all these things, it's still very challenging to deal with. I'm not trying to say tech solves all these problems, but what it does is it provides a kind of a floor or baseline. And I do have a close friend with dyslexia who's my age, who remembers pre-spell check and post. And she said, absolutely, I feel so much more confident if I'm doing a grant application or a job application. I don't worry. And I used to just worry I'd have people read it obsessively. I'd stay up all night reading it again and again and again. And so that affirmed for me the sense of, well, it doesn't completely take away the challenge of having an LD. It would have supported her. So, I mean, of course, it's a theoretical article, and a lot of it is really about my mom. I mean, what happened is a year ago, I went on a writing retreat to start working on another research-based book, and I ended up writing memoir for 3 weeks.
So great.
I call it a midlife crisis. I don't know. And so I have now
your own form of therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still doing all this work on kids in tech, and I am working on a new book on growing up in public and on reputation. And that's the work that people are kind of asking me for and need from me. Everyone needs help with raising their kids in public. It's not clear that anyone's asking me for a memoir. I seem to be writing some memoir essays, so we'll see how that works. It's definitely easier to focus on the work that people are saying, I need this from you, versus the kind of...
Well, I want to talk about the memoir in a second. But again, I was just saying, it's no wonder how anxious kids are. The flip side is that our smartphones, these devices that our kids walk around with, are helpful. They are time saving. They do help with self-esteem for a kid that have no kind of coordination when it comes to directions or spelling. So I really admired that you thought about it in terms of how it would have helped your mom. And those are the positives. And again, go along with your very positive view. But back to the memoir. In the article, which I'm assuming the memoir will explore further, you talk about how, your mom would have moments of exploding on you by throwing things and kicking, because as you point out, sometimes when you have learning disabilities or ADHD, it can come with irritability. And that's totally makes sense, right? Anyone would be frustrated over things that are just, stopping them. When you were a child, did you understand that your mother had a learning disability?
Not at all. No, she saw herself as not smart and would talk about that, actually. I mean, what I was saying is, it's not that she overall thought she was just dumb, right? But she would get really frustrated. And, my father's a scientist and has his own sort of interesting neurological array, but doesn't have LDs, and certainly really did well in school and has a Ph.D. and all of that. So I think in contrast, she saw herself differently, and she saw me differently too. And there was, I think, resentment that school was definitely easy for me. And again, that wasn't overt. She would just kind of say things that made me feel like that was challenging for her. And some of that I also see more in retrospect, like some of the comments that she made that maybe were just incomprehensible even to me as a kid. Wasn't that she was mad at me. I mean, she said all the right things when I got good grades. She was like, oh, that's really great, But I think there was a little bit of alienation as well. Like, why is this so easy for you? And I just think life was really overwhelming for her. And again, I talk about this in the article that for me, the ways I'm more like my mom is that I struggle with organization. My house isn't super neat. That's probably an understatement. My house is messy unless I pay someone to clean it. And my car is really messy. In fact, my son, one of the few paid chores he has is helping clean out my car. And my stepmother was like, yeah, you're like underpaid kid. You should charge your mom more. I mean, it's interesting, right? That my office, my desk is a mess. And I also would struggle before digital calendars to keep track of my time and keep track of long projects. And I've been so grateful to have word processing to keep track of long projects and also a digital calendar that I share with my husband. I actually don't know how working parents raised children without a digital calendar.
Going back to the assembly, when you asked parents if they would want to go back, I wanted to ask you that question. Would you have liked to have grown up with a smartphone?
That's a tough one because my take on this is pretty rosy, but I do think that there would have been some exclusion for me and some maybe negative experiences with social media. On the other hand, I think I would have loved to have a Tumblr or even a YouTube channel and to have expressed myself that way. And I think I could imagine a world where I found a really great creative community and where I really felt connected to some people that I met online. But I can also imagine that it would have been really rough on some of the social things. So I would say I have mixed feelings about that. I certainly spent a lot of time on the phone, on the old school kind of phone with the curly wire that I dragged around the house. So I know I would have spent a lot of time on whatever I had because I only wanted to be talking to my friends all the time.
I know. I would have been right there with you. So when I first began teaching, I started with a chalkboard and like within the year, it moved to a whiteboard. And then over the years, it's now become a smartboard. And I know now when kids hit 5th or 6th grade, they do most of their work on laptops and most of their homework now is turned in through the cloud. So much is done on screen. I'm just very curious how you feel about this progression.
Well, I think it's tough with the screen when the screen is connected to the internet in terms of homework because you're trying to do your homework at the site of the party.
Right.
Whereas when I was writing my college essays on the old word processor, there was nothing else to do on that Apple II other than write my college essay and just me and the blinking cursor. And so it is tough for our kids. And I think we need to be open with them that it's even tough for us sometimes to focus on our laptops and give them some strategies that they can try to help them focus, whether it's using apps to block distractions, whether it's turning off the internet for an hour. There are many things we can do to help, but it's really important that kids know that they're not alone and that it's hard for everyone.
Yeah, it's just so easy to go, as you said, go down that rabbit hole. What I see is that my teenagers, they're listening to music, they've got YouTube going, and then they tell me they're still studying. It's this like kind of shallow multitasking that I think is what is making many parents anxious.
Yeah, it's understandable why folks are worried about that. I would recommend a great book on attention that's more optimistic by Kathy Davidson called Now You See It.
Okay, great.
The negative take would be a book like The Shallows.
Right.
So I think I would read both.
Okay.
Kids are better at multitasking potentially than we were, but there's no question that some kinds of multitasking are terrible. Texting and driving is a good example of something nobody should do.
Right. And I'm not sure if it's The Shallows, but is that the book that talks about how like we used to know tons of phone numbers and now we can't even, remember something like a number we just heard?
Yeah, it may be. I mean, definitely our ability to memorize things is different. And I think about that in terms of direction and in terms of, the ways I used to know my way around my hometown versus how I know my current town. But we also have to ask, are there more important things taking up our brain space now, or is it just passwords?
Right. And the truth is, I have to say, like, my daughters know so much. They're like walking encyclopedias, and that's because they have a walking encyclopedia with them, So that is, again, the positive. Do you want to tell us a little bit about becoming a mom? And you had mentioned to me that you experienced some postpartum depression.
Yeah. So I was thinking about your theme in terms of family and mental illness and definitely my mother's learning disabilities and what that meant for our family was one thing that I thought a lot about as I kind of prepared to talk with you. And then I thought, oh, well, my own experience with mental illness happened after I had my son. And it was really sort of stunning because I think as someone who's been relatively privileged to live in a mind that like, I think some people's minds like hurt all the time and my mind didn't. My mind was like, it hurt when things were really bad, but the rest of the time my mind didn't really hurt me. It was stunning because suddenly, not so much right after he was born, but in the months following, I had a lot of trouble with decision making and thinking clearly and was never actually fully diagnosed. But I'm pretty certain now that I had some postpartum, both depression and anxiety. And it really affected me because I had just started a new job and I ended up having to leave. So And on the tenure track, that's not a small thing. So I got a job in my local community where I really wanted to stay. And that was a huge triumph. It really opened my eyes because I had been through depression with other people, right? I'd been through friends, close family members with clinical depression and clinical anxiety. And I thought I had been sympathetic, but I don't think I had realized kind of how mind altering it is to be in the throes of panic or depression to the point where I would look at the train, which was right by my house, and I couldn't decide some days if I should take the train or drive, like what would be the better way to get to work. And I would be just paralyzed by indecision. And then I would drive, for example, and then the train would pass me and I would feel defeated. And that's not how my mind works when I don't have PPD. So it was really awful, but I couldn't talk myself out of it. And as someone who really had valued being a rational, logical person, maybe even having grown up with a mother who did sometimes kind of fall apart, even in public ways, and having felt embarrassed by her and feeling like, well, I'm rational and I'm together and I would never yell in a store. I would never fall apart over the decision of driving versus taking the train. In the end, I'll get there. It was kind of humbling for me to have that experience of, oh, my mind isn't totally in my control here.
Wow. How did you get through the postpartum? Did it just as your son got older, or?
I think when I stopped nursing and my hormones went back to how they had been before, I felt a lot better and could think more clearly. And I think also sleeping through the night. And again, I mean, we parents joke about sleep and everyone kind of says, sleep is an issue, but sleep for me is a mental health issue. And I haven't had any, knock wood, experiences as sort of dire as that first few months of my son's life. But I certainly, when I go for a few nights with very limited sleep for whatever reason, either anxiety or like loud things in my neighborhood or, whatever, I feel like I understand more about mental illness. And again, I don't want to imply that I know things that I don't, right? Like I have no idea internally what it's like to live with something like, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or things that I just haven't experienced personally. When my students come to me, because I still taught for 4 years after that, I have so much sympathy for them in a different way. And I think adolescents and college students we know are struggling with their mental health frequently, and that sometimes they need to take time off of college. And our health insurance isn't designed for that. I've had parents tell me that they can't get therapy where the kids are in college because their health insurance only covers where they live. For example, you send your child out of state. And these are things that parents need to think about when they're sending kids, especially if kids have already had mental health struggles. But a lot of times kids have new mental health struggles as college students. I think it's really important for professors, for example, to understand that. Not that we should be in the role of counselors, but I think a lot of my colleagues kind of grumbled about, why is this our problem? Like if a kid's having a hard time. And I was like, we're the first line of defense. If you see that a student isn't eating, isn't showering, isn't coming to class, right, it's not appropriate to go to their dorm room, but it may be appropriate to reach out to their advisor or reach out to counseling services and say, I'm worried about this student. Or depending on the relationship with the student, reach out directly to the student and say, hey, are you okay? And I think we all need to do that for each other, but especially in these environments where it's so easy to imagine that someone else is doing that. I think it's really important that we all are ready to ask those questions. Certainly, again, when I have new parents in my life, whether they're my younger step siblings or whether it's other people in my community, and someone just doesn't look okay, I might be the one to be like, are you okay? No, really, because I wasn't okay. And it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to get help. It's okay to take medication. It might be okay to have someone else feed your baby so you can sleep for a night. And that might be really important to do. We have to be the people who can ask. And coming back to kids in tech, kids may know that their friends are in trouble emotionally, again, maybe struggling with a momentary crisis or a deeper, more long-term situation, like an eating disorder or thoughts about self-harm, or maybe a momentary crisis like a bad breakup. It's really important that our kids have some tools and resources and that they know it's okay to come to us. If they're worried about a friend, they don't have to keep it in the friend group. And that having access to these digital tools makes kids often feel like they have to be the crisis hotline for their friends. Like because I could have my phone 24/7, I might feel like if my friend's having a really bad time, I should just be there for her 24/7. And then your kid goes into crisis. So sometimes parents think their kid's behavior has changed. And it's not that their kid is in crisis. It's actually a friend and their kid is trying to be this sort of 24/7 hotline for that friend. And that's where we need to go to kids and make sure that they know that you can support your friends. But when it gets to a certain point, you need to bring in some help from outside. You can't do this on your own.
No, you brought up so many good points. And another kind of just thing to add to that is that I know that especially teenagers, if they are concerned about their friends, they often don't want to go speak up about it because they're afraid their friend will be upset with them. But in the end, I think their friends will always appreciate them looking out for them and know that, really it comes from a place of love. And that's actually one of the things that I'm doing when I'm going into high schools for NAMI to talk about ending the silence, to talk about warning signs, because at that age, kids really do care about their friendships. But I really just want to commend you and thank you for talking about your postpartum depression, because it's honesty like that helps others come forward and say, okay, I'm not alone and this will pass and this is normal. That's so fabulous. And I really do appreciate you sharing that and about your mom. So Devorah, if you could write your younger 20-year-old self a love letter, what would it say?
Oh my goodness. I would tell her everything's going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to work out well. And that, I'd probably say dump whatever chump you're currently dating and hold out for someone really good. And eventually that person will be there for you, but it may not be immediately. And also just to trust. I'm still friends with some people I was friends with when I was 20. So I was also making some really good choices about, and I'm 44 now. So we're talking about friendships that have survived more than 2 decades of time and a lot of big transitions for me, for my friends. And so I would also say trust that you're surrounding yourself with some really great people. And even certainly some of those friendships haven't lasted or, haven't survived, whatever geography or time, but were still good choices in that moment. And I think that's the thing I would probably say is the strongest.
So, Devorah, do you have any habits that bring you happiness?
I love to swim in Lake Michigan in the summer. It's clearly where I live. Outdoor swimming is something we only do in the summer here, and only, late summer, now in July. But it's really nice. Swimming in living water is great. I swim in the winter as well and, lap swimming at the Y, but it's not the same as the lake. So that's probably my favorite thing to do right now.
That's awesome. Do you listen to headphones? Do you have those?
No, I just swim. Swim.
You're no tech, just the water.
It's great. It's great.
Where can the listeners find you besides the show notes? Where else?
Sure. So my website is raisingdigitalnatives.com, and then Screenwise, my book, is available anywhere where you can get books. So, the great large river of digital book selling is available, or your local independent bookstore, anywhere you want to get Screenwise, you can get it. And then I'm happy to come to your community to speak to parents and teachers and kids in your community. So I'm happy to do that.
Great. Yeah. I'm excited to see you when you come to LA again. Well, this has been fantastic. And I really know that you are going to help not just parents, but maybe even the teens that may have listened with their parents and anyone that uses technology. We should look at it and find the positives in it and not just fear it. And also thank you for just opening your heart and being so honest. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. I definitely think that we all need to be honest and try to end the stigma around all kinds of mental illness and other kinds of disabilities, and really embrace the diversity of just the human community where, everyone is both struggling and thriving, right, all at once. And we need to kind of be real about that.
That's right. Celebrate it all. Right?
Yeah.
Differences are a good thing. Diversity is a good thing. All right. Well, Devorah, thank you again, and we'll speak soon. I want to thank Benjamin King for that awesome intro you heard at the beginning and for helping me produce this podcast. And thank you to Ari Silberman, the music composer. This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.